extended passages, one of Sota and the Nazir. There's an association between them, as Rashi famously says. The first part of it, though, deals with a census. It's a continuation of last week's Parsha, which described in detail the census of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then towards the end of last week's Parsha, we have a more detailed census, more detailed in the sense that it is subdivided within the three sort of sub-tribes within Shevet Levi of that particular tribe. The tribe of Levi is analyzed or is counted in a more thorough fashion. As I say, three sub-tribes are identified. Not only that, but the roles of each of the three sub-tribes are also designated. What's interesting, and that's where we will begin, what's interesting is that the Parsha begins, Nasoas Rosh B'nei Gershon Gamheim, count the heads, or really lift up the heads, elevate or exalt the heads of the family of Gershon Gamheim, them too. And then the Torah turns to the B'nei Memrari, that's the third group within the Shevet Levi. We have Kahas, last week's Parsha, we have Gershon today, in this week's Parsha, and then we go on to Merari. But what's interesting, and that's what I'd like to draw attention to, is that towards the end, if you look at towards the end of the census of the tribe of Levi, when the Torah is summing up, so if you look at Perek Hey, Pasuk Mem Vav, chapter 5, verse 46, there the Torah says, Kol asher pakad Moshe ve'Aharon u'nesiyei Yisrael es haleviim mishkosam leveisavosam. When the Torah is summing up from the ages of 30 to the ages of 50 and the various roles and responsibilities, but the Torah mentions that this census is undertaken by Moshe ve'Aharon u'nesiyei Yisrael, the tribes of Israel, the heads of the tribe, the princes of each tribe, as Halevim, they're counted in the Levium. So Rabbi Yonatan should ask, why were the why were the princes of the 12 tribes, why were they involved in counting the Levium? What interest is it of theirs? What business is it of theirs? Moshe and Aharon, we understand, they are actually from the tribe of Levi as well. Moshe is the head of the whole Jewish people, of course. Aharon is the prince of the tribe of Levi. We can understand why they undertook the project. It may well be they had a whole series of assistants and census takers, etc. But those are the, let's say, the administrators or the personnel who actually carry out the work. It's overseen by Moshe and Aaron. That's fine. Why do we need the Nisim? Why do you have the 12 tribes of the 12 princes of Israel as well? It's interesting. Last week we asked a similar question, and he explained, and Eibeschutz explained that they were there. They were the princes of the 12 tribes were elected popularly or appointed by popular acclaim within each tribe because they were there to represent the interests of each tribe. Because a census has financial implications always, and especially in that case, because it was pertinent to the allocation of the tracts of land in Eretz Israel. He says something here a little bit similar. I would like to suggest that it's similar, but first let me tell you what he says exactly. He says that the Nisim were there because the Shevet Levi had an important role. Their important role, as we know, was to serve as the religious leaders. In the Midbar, they were responsible for dismantling, for assembling, for transporting the Mishkan itself. They lived in the vicinity, they encamped in the vicinity of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. Moreover, in a wider sense, they were the ecclesiastical class. They were the clerics, they were the rabbis, they were the teachers, they were the spiritual leaders, they were the scholars, they were the sages. They were responsible for the spiritual well-being of the nation, and therefore they did not have any land in Eretz Israel allocated to them. They had a number of cities, but they had no homestead for the purpose of agricultural cultivation. So how did they survive? What was their livelihood? Of course, we know the answer. Their livelihood was through the maaseh that was given by the other tribes. According to that, Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz says the reason the Nisim were there is that it wasn't so much that they were there to count them, but they were there to appoint them. They were there to designate the Levium, to induct the Levium into their role as the representatives of the nation, because the Levium were first chosen for that position because the Bechorim, the firstborn, were a bust because they participated or were complicit in some way, at least in the Chet HaEgel. It was only Shevet Levi who collectively refused to participate, protested, and even executed justice against those who worshiped the golden calf. And at that time, Shevet Levi was elevated to its role and replaced the Chorim who were otherwise, of course, spread throughout the children of Israel. And that situation gave way to a circumstance in which the Levium had that position. In other words, the Levium are acting on behalf of each of the 12 tribes. So the Nisim, the princes of the 12 tribes, were there because they oversaw the counting of the Levium, but more than the counting, they were there to appoint the Levium and to establish Levium in the role and to charge them with the responsibility to act on behalf of the children of Israel and for the betterment of Bnei Israel, of the general community. I would like to add to this, based on what I mentioned a few minutes ago, just like we saw the Nisim represented the interests of each tribe when it came to counting the members of the tribe, taking the census, in a similar way here as well. The Levium, of course, were supported through the Maaser of Bnei Israel. It was if you like, a form of tax, really, that was given. It was the support. In our terms, in contemporary Jewish terms, we'd consider this a charitable donation. It's the religious leaders who are supported, who are, so to speak, employed by the community for the betterment of the community. Well, that's the case. Of course, the Nisim have an interest in what the Levium are all about. They want to know how many of them there are, how many are on the payroll, effectively. It's like if a donor or maybe the board of directors of Mir Yeshiva comes to visit the yeshiva in Yerushalayim, where they've got large numbers, thousands of Yundalite, who are all, most of them are getting a subsidy, getting a stipend from the yeshiva. So these guys, these Balabatim, generous supporters, are paying the bill, or at least they are taking responsibility to raise the money. And of course, it's natural that they want to see, and in fact, they would be expected by the community to oversee the progress of this kollel, to speak to some of the Yundalite. What are they up to? Are they really devoted? Are they dedicated to their studies? Are they worthy of filling that position? So even though, of course, the Levium were born into that role, and it wasn't a question of choosing it or seeking an easier life without laboring in the field, growing barley and grapes and olives, pomegranates, wheat, etc. It wasn't necessarily a role that each one chose for himself, but nevertheless, that was the role to which he was born. So naturally, the Nisim do have an interest, and I think that is what Rabbi Eibeschutz means when he says Kol HaPekudim, all of the designation, all of the charge in the sense of the induction of these Levim into their role was done by Moshe and Aaron and the Nisi'ei Yisrael. I would just like to add that there's a famous passage in the Rambam. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. If not, let me just bring it to your attention. Famous passage at the end of the laws of Shemitah v'Yovel in the Mishnah Torah, in which the Rambam speaks about the role of Shevet Levi, who were supported by the community, as we know. And the Rambam says that this idea that a person who is devoted to religious growth, and not only his own religious development, but being a conduit for the betterment and the blessing of the Jewish people, of inspiring or teaching or guiding or directing or rendering halachic decisions for the betterment of the community. Anyone, says the Rambam, who chooses to devote himself to spiritual affairs and does not expend his time and energy in earning a livelihood, but he wants to be completely dedicated to spiritual matters, so such a person has the opportunity by choice to join the ranks of the Levium, not in the literal halachic sense, but in the conceptual sense, and that he will choose for himself the role in life of Shevet Levi. The Rambam says, "Lo Shevet Levi bilvad," but anyone who chooses to do that, I think he says, "Ish ve'isha," whether a man or a woman, any person who chooses to do that, Hashem will support that person. By implication, he suggests that the community, just as the community should support Shevet Levi, the community maybe has a duty to support such people as well. A very famous passage in the Rambam, which is often cited as the paradigm or the maybe umbrella category under which the whole kollel system nowadays would fall, in which you have a certain number of young people, sometimes not so young. My brother-in-law has been a kollel Jungerman for about 40 years in Bnei Brak. But someone who devotes himself to the study of Torah has the right to do so and is praised for doing so, as kind of taking up, shouldering the spiritual burden and shunning the opportunities for maybe material gain that he could acquire through earning a livelihood. The thing is, I heard from Mori Rabbi Rav Moshe Shapiro, Zichron Bracha, that in his view, this is a very arrogant suggestion that all the yeshiva light, all those who are learning in yeshiva and those who are learning in the kollelim, the married students, as you said, not only young, but sometimes they do so for years and years. He said it's quite arrogant to imagine that they are all fulfilling what the Rambam says. The implication is the Rambam is talking about a handful of people in the entire generation, not the opposite situation in which you have large numbers, even a majority of the whole birth cohort in certain circles who choose that kind of kollel path. But rather, he said, the paradigm for the yeshiva system has to be more along the lines of Yisachar and Zvulun, where you have someone who, again, is like the role of Yisachar, who has a partnership, whether an actual written arrangement with a particular patron, or more collectively with the Jewish community, who will support such people. He said, but that comes with responsibilities as well. At any rate, this is what Yonatan Eibeschutz says, and it's hinted to, I think, quite compellingly by saying that the Nisim were also part of this process. And as I've mentioned many times in the past, how many times have I read these psukim without personally, only for myself, noticing the anomaly of Nisiyei Yisrael counting the Levim as well. Let's go on now to the next major subject, which there are some other important passages along the way, but we're going to turn now to the Sota. And when we turn there, we find in Pasuk Yud Beis something interesting, always interesting. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem. So the first pasuk Yud Aleph is Hashem Hashem spoke to Moshe, and he said. By the way, Rabbi Eibeschutz has something to say about that expression as well. But we'll say that maybe for another time. Even though that's a very conventional pasuk, he's got something to tell us on that. We'll save it for a different time. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem ish kisiste ishto u'ma'alo vo ma'al. So I've got two completely different thoughts I want to share with you tonight from Yonatan Eibeschutz. Daber ben Israel, speak to the children of Israel, Matalem, and say to them, ish, every man or any man, kisiste ishto, whose wife strays. The word sota really means to stray, kitiste, who strays. Uma'ala vo ma'al, and she acts treacherously towards him. Now, as we'll see, the Torah is referring to the possibility of marital infidelity, which the sota ordeal will clarify. So although the sota phenomenon of drinking from this water in which the name of God and other words have been dissolved, some dust from the under the courtyard or the under the tile of the courtyard of the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash, it's a potentially grisly ordeal, fairly unpleasant. However, it serves as an instrument for restoring marital trust, where the relationship has been undermined, where suspicion has poisoned the relationship between husband and wife. So these waters can have the effect of allaying those suspicions. But nevertheless, the whole phenomenon only gets started if the woman has acted in a way so as to arouse the suspicion of her husband. And I don't want to go into the specifics of that now. Only under certain conditions is a husband given the authority to insist that his wife has to come to the Beis Hamikdash to drink the water, etc. And again, she may be proven innocent, and if so, that's great. If she's proven guilty, then the consequences indeed will be quite dire. But we're talking here about an instance of suspected adultery, and there are good grounds to suspect her of marital infidelity. I might as well tell you right now, because it's going to be important for later, that this system, the Torah tells us, only works when the husband and actually even members of the household are innocent of their own peccadillos. If they are also, or if he is also up to no good in his private affairs, then the waters of the Sota, even if she's guilty, will not have any effect on her. So only where he is completely innocent and she is guilty, then she'll pay the consequence. But it says, uh, or something like that, that it only works when the man, is innocent. Okay, that's by way of important background so that we understand what Rabbi Eibeschutz tells us. Now, take a look, please. I hope you have Rashi's commentary there. Rashi quotes Gemara in Brachos about Smichus HaParshios, the juxtaposition of this passage of the Sota with what came before it. So take a look at what comes before, whether on the previous page or perhaps on the same page for you. And there the Torah speaks about the gifts to the Kohanim. The Kohanim were allocated a certain number of gifts, different categories, 24 altogether. And the Torah says in verse 10, V'ish es kadashav lo yihiyu, ish she'ten la kohen lo yihiyeh. A person has to give gifts to the Kohen, certain proportions that he's required to give to the Kohen. So we have an interesting phenomenon in which the Torah speaks about giving the Kohen the portions that are supposed to go to the Kohen. And then we turn the page, and the immediate next verse says, speak to the children of Israel about a man who suspects his wife, ish ish kitis te ishto. Says Rashi in Pasuk Yud Beis, Ma kasuv l'mala min ha'inyan. What is written immediately before this subject of the Sota? V'ish es kodashav lo yihiyu. Says Rashi, Ima tama akev matnos hakohen. If you withhold the gifts to the Kohen that you're supposed to give, you're going to have to approach that very Kohen, to bring your wife who is suspected of infidelity. In other words, if a man neglects to provide for the Kohen in the way that he should, the time will come when he will need to avail himself of the services of the Kohen. And of course, it's a very tragic, unpleasant ordeal. And even though, as we said, that if she is innocent, then no harm will come to her, marital harmony will be restored. But one can well imagine there will be quite a lot of hard feelings within that marriage. Hopefully not, but it could well be. Certainly, that sort of scenario is not something which any person, any husband would welcome. And therefore, the Torah is saying, according to Rashi, there's a kind of implied consequence or punishment for someone who is niggardly. He withholds the gifts that he is supposed to give to the Kohen. He will eventually need to approach that Kohen. As for Yonatan Eibeschutz, what is the Midah Keneged Midah? Now, at the simple level, we've already explained it. He doesn't provide for the Kohen. As a punishment, he's going to now need the services of the Kohen in a way that he doesn't welcome, that he would much rather not have to do. But Rabbi Eibeschutz wants to know, is there some further mechanism, some further logic underlying the idea that because he didn't give to the Kohen, therefore he's going to need the Kohen? Is the fact that the man did not give to the Kohen, is that somehow going to encourage or prompt his wife? Maybe from his point of view, it's a punishment for him. But what is her role in this? Does it mean she's going to be unfaithful or suspected of infidelity just because her husband won't give to the Kohen? Says Yonatan Eibeschutz, yes. It's got a very clever explanation. The Gemara says that a person who withholds the due to the Kohen, that the portions he's supposed to give to the Kohen, the challah goes to the Kohen, and the first shearing of the sheep goes to the Kohen, and the first of the flock goes to the Kohen. If he refuses to do that, if he declines to do so, the consequence will be poverty. Ma'osav mismotetin, ubali de anios. His resources, his wealth, his money, his sheep and his flock and his agricultural yield will suffer, and he will become impoverished. That's going to be the punishment. The interesting thing is, the Gemara in Sota says that's the Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara in Sota says that someone who is a man who is promiscuous, he will also come to poverty. So Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz says as follows, that if this man, or rather the woman's husband, if the woman's husband did not come to poverty, so she would be cautious, or she would be inhibited from having an affair, because she would be worried her husband will suspect it. He doesn't even have to know for certain, even if he has grounds for, has to be well-defined grounds for suspicion, not just a hunch. But under certain circumstances, if he's suspicious, he can take her to the base of Mikdash, drink the waters of Sota, and if she's guilty, it's curtains for her. So therefore, that will inhibit her. But if she sees that her husband has become poor, so she will assume he's lost his money because he is himself promiscuous. And as the Gemara says, that a man who is promiscuous, will come to poverty. So she'll think to herself, well, if he is promiscuous, then the Mesote won't work, meaning I have nothing to fear anymore. Because if he's playing the field in that way and he's partying and going out to the lap dancing clubs, then if he's a scoundrel, then even if the woman might say, commit adultery, I'm going to be sort of inoculated, if you use that term, against the consequences, because since he is also guilty, so I won't come to harm. So that's how Yonatan Eibeschutz explains it. That if he doesn't give to the Kohen, he'll become poor. But she will immediately assume the poverty is not because of he won't give to the Kohen. The poverty is because of the other reason. If it's the other reason, then she also will get up to the same business. He quotes the Gemara in Megillah, based on the Gemara in Megillah, that says, "Ihu bikra v'ihi bebotzine." He with pumpkins and she with a zucchini, which is a way of saying that if he is doing his thing, which he shouldn't be, then she'll do hers. Now, I will leave it for your speculation whether the imagery of the pumpkin for him and the zucchini for her has a deeper significance. You might think that it does. You might be right, actually. But in any case, that's what the Gemara says, that she'll follow his example, a bit like royal marriage, for those who remember it some years ago. I'm reminded of the famous comment by George Best. For those who know who George Best was, I'm sure all the guys do. He said, I spent a lot of money on fast cars, exotic women, and expensive booze. The rest I just squandered. So, it could be that there's a certain logic here to the phenomenon that the man who is promiscuous, he comes to poverty because he's spending all his money on his paramours. And that's why he doesn't have money for other needs. So if the household, doesn't mean that every person who's struggling financially is in either of these categories, but in any case, for the purposes of the drash, that's what Yonatan Eibeschutz suggests. That's the because of Parashios, because the fact that he became impoverished, that's why she is involved potentially in adulterous liaisons, because she's convinced that the poverty is because of his behavior, in which case, firstly, she may feel it's tit for tat. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, and those kinds of things. But, or as I said, the Talmudic metaphor about the pumpkins and the zucchini. But in any case, that would explain why she also is doing the same. And excuse me, and that's why he may need to take his wife to the Kohen. Of course, according to this, it won't work, because if he's guilty in his own right, it won't work to prosecute her either. Got a few minutes left. I want to share one last thought. Excuse me. Also on this pasuk, completely different aspect of it. We'll read it again. Speak to the children of Israel. Say to them, Ish, every man, whose wife strays, umala vo mal, and she is treacherous towards him. She betrays him. So ish, of course, requires an explanation. At the simple level, it just means any man, every man. Okay, Rashi has a beautiful interpretation. Ish, that she is betraying her husband, and she's betraying Hashem as well. Hashem is called Ish. Hashem Ish Milchama. So Hashem is also called Ish, so to speak, the one on earth to whom she has a responsibility of fidelity, and Hashem in the heavens whom she is betraying as well. Okay, but that's just Rashi, just by the by. Says Yonatan Eibeschutz something different, and again, it may be a bit provocative, it may be a bit politically incorrect, but he doesn't mean it in the, in terms of culpability, or, looking to identify a more egregious example, or a less egregious form of adultery. He doesn't mean that, but he does mention two different categories. I think he's got something to commend it. He suggests there are two scenarios, two reasons that a woman might stray in this way. One reason is because she craves sexual adventure. This is maybe the classic adulteress, whether someone has groomed her, or she's flirted with him, or whatever it might be. A whole range of possibilities, not for us to explore right now. Leave that to the therapists. But he says that's one thing, and that's what the Gemara calls ruach shtus. Ish kitiste. You show the word soteh with a sin. Soteh with a sin is related to the word shtus. Shtus is foolishness, like the word shoteh. Shtus, ruach shtus. It means a spirit of folly, or you might even say, and some have suggested this as well, a kind of insanity, temporary insanity. A person doesn't sin in a kind of egregious way unless he is the victim of temporary insanity, or a spirit of folly has come over him. And we would say this is passion, this is Yetzer hara, that is overwhelming a person, clouding her better judgment. Someone, as I said, it's an act of passion, or one who craves that kind of exotic experience in an extramarital context. That's one possibility. That's ish. The other ish describes a different phenomenon entirely. This is a woman, okay, she's no tzadekis because she is unfaithful, but it's because her husband is either sterile, cannot produce children year after year, or maybe he's impotent, can't even get it together in the basic sense, in which case, of course, she's possibly feeling a bit neglected. But even beyond that aspect, even if mechanically things are fine, but actually she goes year after year, she's not able to conceive, she's childless, and she desires a child. She wants to have a child to support her in her old age. She wants to have a child so that her husband's wealth after 120 years will go to her own progeny, to their own progeny. Well, theirs not happening because he can't produce. So he wants to have a child. Basically, she wants to conceive through an extramarital fling. Now, of course, in those days, until quite recently, IVF, AID, and that kind of thing, assisted conception did not exist. So if a woman, married or whatever state she is in, is desperate to conceive, and she's not able to, through the husband that she has, so to speak, available to her, so such a woman might be motivated to seek to conceive through an extramarital affair. Again, he's not coming to say which instance is more blameworthy, etc. I mean, that's not the point. He's just explaining from the Parshanut point of view. So he says the second case is Uma'ala Voma'al. She is betraying her husband because, okay, he's not able to father a child. She can sue for divorce, halachically, by the way. She can say he's not giving me children, and actually they may even be required to divorce. But in any case, she's allowed to sue for divorce according to the halacha. What she's not allowed to do is to seek external opportunities in this kind of extramarital affair manner. But that would be malavo mal. She's betrayed. So of course, she won't say to anyone that this child is from the friend around the corner or someone I met in the club. She'll say, okay, this is my husband's child, of course. So therefore, she's betraying him. So this is the ish kitiste ishto, the two scenarios, and of course both are blameworthy. Both would, in principle, land her in the Beis Hamikdash drinking the water, and the consequences could be dire if indeed she is guilty. But in any case, those are the two. That's how he explains the ish kitiste ishto, the two scenarios, two possibilities, broadly speaking, why a woman might be involved in extramarital affair. Obviously, if she's raped, etc., this will not apply at all. But again, it's not the time or the place to go into the subject in too much further detail from that point of view. From the Parashanic point of view, I think Yished's very illuminates the subject very creatively, as always. And thank you again for listening. So maybe just to review, we've seen how the 12 Nesiim were also part of counting the Leviim, but not just counting them, but designating them, appointing them, charging them, inducting them into their role. And we can understand why they wanted to be there, because ultimately the Leviim are supported by the community. The Nesiim representing each tribe want to check up on them and be sure how many of them there are, how many are we looking after, and are they in turn giving the community value for money, so to speak. Secondly, we said about the why it is that the poverty will cause her to be unfaithful, because she will assume that the poverty is because it's a punishment for his philandering. We also suggested that practically philandering can be an expensive exercise as well. So the fact there's not enough money around for the household might make her wonder what he's doing with all the money, etc. We speculate along those lines. And finally, the two broad circumstances in which a woman might be motivated to seek affection outside of the marriage relationship, and better to see a marriage counselor certainly before it comes to any of that. Anyway, thank you very much. Sorry, down on a slightly downbeat note, but this sota is never going to leave us, I suppose, too delighted. But I'm sure we can learn something wise from it. And yeah, so thank you very much for everybody's attention. If you have any questions or comments, happy to entertain them. Yeah, lots in the Parsha.
Thank you very much.
I have a little bit of a question. It just seems like, this is, I realize that the Torah, anyone who's going to be following the Torah, you would think wouldn't do things like steal or have an extramarital affair or anything like that. So,
well, the variety of human nature and the reality of human nature, I think, challenges that assumption. Yes, the Torah is for all the Jewish people, including the righteous, as well as those who are less than righteous, as well as everyone in between who has weaknesses from time to time. So I'm sure you're right, and I'm not in any way saying a bit of marital infidelity has to be expected. I don't mean that. But some people are strong in some areas and weak in other areas. As I said, in terms of like the theft, it's true it's wrong to withhold the maaser, but how many people are tempted to give less than they should, or even to pay taxes in a less than they should, even in a way which is of doubtful legality. So this is the part of human nature. So I'm not exonerating it, but the Jewish people are diverse, ranging from the greatest to those who are less than great. So, we do have.
So this would be a circumstantial mitzvah. This would only take place if somebody erred in a terrible way.
Absolutely. The sota is not something to be sought after or to try. It's a mitzvah that a person should try to fulfill. Definitely not. It's only in a certain tragic scenario that the sota phenomenon would even take place, and probably was never that common. I have no reason to think that it was a regular, frequent feature even in the days of antiquity. Many portions of the Torah are there for us to learn from, and not necessarily that it came about practically on frequent occasion. I must go because I need to get daven mincha still. So, Ruthi, if you want to hold court, bakasha. Otherwise, Shabbat Shalom lekulam.